Hello there. My name's Amber. I considered myself to be child-free before my fiancé's family forced me to change my mind. And that's when all my problems began. Like mother, like daughter, they say. I met Steve at college and we fell in love very quickly. He proposed to me when I was 23 years old. We lived together as a common couple, saved money for our wedding, and I wasn't very adventurous. 1 week before the wedding, Steve and I had a meeting with a music band and decorator. Suddenly, Steve received a call from his 14-year-old niece, Candace. She told him that she had run away from home. You see, Steve had an older sister, Sharon, a very annoying alcoholic woman. They lived in another city nearby. When we arrived back home, Candy was sitting by the door and crying. I felt so sorry for her. We allowed her to stay with us for as long as necessary. Candace told me some horrible things about her life with her mother. Sharon changed boyfriends every week, and the last one was a thief. He took Candace's stuff without her permission. One day he had stolen her school laptop to resell it because he needed cash, and Candace failed to pass her exams because of him. She was afraid to go back home because they yelled at her all the time. She spent most of her evenings hiding out in a laundromat near their condo. When Candace fell asleep, I told Steve that she could not go back to her mother. Steve was pissed off too. He had no idea that it was that bad. Our shock made us forget about the upcoming wedding, but it wasn't easy for Steve to file a complaint to social services about his own sister. We decided to keep her as our guest until the wedding day and figure out the legal issues later. I had been planning my wedding since I was a little girl. But unfortunately, my sweet dreams had been ruined by Sharon. She arrived in the middle of the party with her kleptomaniac boyfriend. They got very drunk, and Sharon began to yell that we had kidnapped her daughter and that she was going to call the police. It was pretty ugly. Candace was hiding from her and crying in the kitchen. When Steve finally managed to make them go away, I was just exhausted, and I wanted to go to sleep. Additionally, we couldn't just leave Candace alone, so I was forced to postpone the honeymoon, which was painful. During the next few months, I've been dealing with tons of paperwork to make myself and Stephen the official guardians of Candace because her mother was inadequate and refused to get treatment for her alcohol problem. Our honeymoon budget was spent on lawyers. Very exotic way to have a baby, right? Once Candace got used to our home, she began to act a little weird, but I explained it by telling myself it was because of her trauma. She never helped me around the house and avoided any responsibilities. It's embarrassing to admit, but I even did her homework. After work, like an idiot. Why like an idiot? We'll find out later. 2 years passed by very quickly. Steve was working all the time, and I'd had to face Candace and her expectations on my own. And it was literal hell. For example, one day I sent Steve a provocative picture. I left my phone on the bed and went to take a shower. When I returned, I noticed that the picture had been emailed to all my colleagues at the bank where I worked. The next day, I had to explain to my boss that it was a terrible mistake. It was very embarrassing. My colleagues still remind me of that incident. When I asked Candy why she did that, she denied everything. Steve also took her aside and assumed that I did it by myself accidentally. But wait, it gets worse. The next month, I put a mask on my hair as usual, but suddenly I felt something different. My scalp was burning. I washed it off quickly. After applying that mask, I lost around 60% of my hair, and my skin got partially burned. I returned that product to the store and filed an official complaint to the manufacturer, but the expert commission revealed that someone mixed the mask with some kind of bulk hair removal lotion. I was sure that it was Candace, but again, I had no evidence. I didn't feel safe in my own home. I had to lock my stuff away and change my passwords every day. I took Candace to a psychologist. She attended sessions with him several times, but then complained to Steve that I was forcing her to do something she didn't want to do. Steve and I had a fight, but it wasn't helpful at all. Meanwhile, Candace switched her attention from me to boys and school fights. When we celebrated her 16th birthday, she invited her new boyfriend, Nicholas, an exchange student from France. I was hoping that love would improve her character, but nope. During the next several months, I had to pick them up in the middle of nowhere at night several times. They attended some very sketchy parties and garage concerts. One day, I returned from work a little earlier and found them in my bedroom, eating snacks in our bed. Both Candace and Nicholas were wearing my dresses and lingerie. They told me that they just wanted to have fun. I yelled at Candace and kicked them out. She left the house screaming that I was just like her mother. Later that night, she didn't answer my calls. Steve was on a business trip, and I was stressing out. But then I received a call from an unknown number. A pleasant male voice with a French accent told me that Candace and Nicholas had been caught stealing in a clothing store. I went to the police and met Jules, Nicholas's older brother. He lived in the USA and was here on a work visa. Luckily, he was a lawyer and figured everything out quickly. When the kids were let go, I began to cry because I was so tired. To cheer me up, Jules asked me out for dinner. He took me to a nice restaurant, and I finally got a chance to vent my feelings. I confessed that I hated being a mother. Jules laughed and said that he could not blame me for that. I felt like I had fallen in love with that guy at first sight. I knew it was wrong, but I just couldn't help myself. That night, I cheated on my husband for the first time. But not the last. Jules and I began to date on a regular basis when he was in the city. I felt ashamed about my dirty little secret, but at the same time, I enjoyed it. Steve had been ignoring my emotional needs for too long. After that incident with police, Candace and Steve had a serious conversation about her future and college, and she began to behave much better. 2 years later, I was still secretly dating Jules. Candace turned 18 and Nicholas proposed to her officially. Too early to get married? Maybe, but I was so glad to get rid of her. In August, we went to France. Nicholas's family invited us to their house in Normandy to finally meet the bride and her parents. I was very nervous because Jules was a part of that family event too. Normandy was absolutely beautiful, as well as Nicholas and Jules' parents. Jules took us to a tour around the area. He was very jealous to see me with Steve, and I had to hide my feelings too. I'm not proud of that, but Jules and I had several dates in an old barn behind the house. One day I was picking berries in the garden, and suddenly Candace jumped out of nowhere. She had found out our little secret. Candace told me that she was willing to keep my affair with Jules a secret if I provided her with a monthly salary and some additional services. I was amazed. How did she manage to become such a brat? Of course I didn't want Steve to find out about my guilty pleasure, so I agreed. I know, stupid. But I panicked so much. Candace also admitted that she replaced my hair mask and sent that photo to my colleagues. She promised not to do anything like that again if I behaved well. Apparently, the psychologist I hired was a fraud. After that conversation, Candace began to drop hints. During dinner, she was shamelessly flirting with Jules, just to see my reaction. Jules was kind of responding to her, which pissed me off. Meanwhile, Steve Nicholas and his parents had no idea about what was going on. Needless to say, I was very glad to finally get home. Nicholas wanted to graduate from college in the USA and then move with Candace to Paris. Having returned from Normandy, they moved into Jules' apartment and began to live as a trio. I could not spend time with Jules at his home anymore, so we began to meet less often. Meanwhile, I used to send money to Candace, secretly. One day, she asked me to come over and clean all of her shoes, just to make fun of me. As I was fulfilling that ridiculous order, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. I returned home that night and found Steve playing video games in the living room. I told him about my affair and asked for a divorce. It was a very sad moment, and Steve looked like he finally woke up. Later that night, I had a date with Jules. We met in a hotel, and he was passionate as usual. But when I started a serious conversation, he changed. I told him the good news about my divorce, and he was very surprised and confused. Jules hugged me and said he could not be with me any longer because he had met someone else, a new girlfriend. My heart jumped out of my chest. The name of that girlfriend was Candace, his brother's fiancée. He was madly in love with her. I could not believe my ears. On the other hand, it was a fair punishment for me betraying Steve. Jules told me not to be upset and offered to order some dessert and champagne. I slapped his cheek and ran away to find Steve. Steve didn't answer my calls, and his friends helped me find him in a pub. He didn't want to talk to me, but I insisted. We sat in that pub all night, playing darts and talking about us. I was begging Steve to forgive me. He apologized for letting Candace torture me. It turned out that Steve also had a short affair 3 years ago, and Candace caught him. She manipulated and extorted money. What a twist! That's why he was afraid to argue with her all that time. On the one hand, I hate Candace, but on the other, I admire her. As for now, Steve and I are seeing a family psychotherapist and trying to save our marriage. Meanwhile, Candace dumped Nicholas and is traveling around the world with her new boyfriend, Jules.